just say before I begin, I'm going to be far more personal in this address, I think, than I've ever been before. And in that sense, perhaps I'm taking some liberties. But you know, I feel we're a community, and I've been around here a long time, and so have many of you, and we know each other well. And I feel very comfortable, really, talking to you in a very personal vein that's important to me. And for those of you who don't know you, perhaps you'll find something of value, nevertheless, that comes out of my own personal experience, which comprises part of my address, not all of it. The title of my address this morning comes from a line in the poem Tintern, Abbey, written by the British Romantic poet William Wordsworth. But the inspiration for my address is profoundly personal. It emerges out of the death of my beloved wife, Linda, who is known to many of you and who died about 3.5 years ago. For me, and I suspect most other people who have lost their intimate partners who shared their lives with them, and in the case of Linda and me, it was a relationship of more than 40 years, one is left with a profound sense of grief. I won't speak about grief very much this morning. It's an emotional phenomenon I have found that is like no other, with its own unique character and its very distinctive dynamics. Grief is a phenomenon which I conclude one cannot fully understand unless a person has experienced it. And I know before Linda's death, I did not understand it. I'm writing a short book about grief and a multitude of feelings and thoughts that accompany it, in great measure because I have found very, very little writing which actually describes those feelings and thoughts in ways that I can identify with. I've read quite a lot about grief since Linda died, including self-help books, which I have found not to be very helpful when confronted with the harsh reality of the death of one's intimate partner. Let me just briefly say that in my experience, the death of a loved one is an amputation. And at its least, it leaves a scar which will be with me for the rest of my life. One, I believe, one does never get over such a loss. The best that one can do is grow around it, make adjustments, try to fill up as much empty space as one can, and move on day to day as best as one is able. But this is really not the centerpiece of what I want to talk about this morning. This morning I want to touch upon one and only one thing that has emerged out of my loss. But first I need to say something about myself and my temperament, which helps to frame my values and where I'm coming from. The philosopher William James had once noted that, quote, life is serious business, end quote. And I agree. I am not a pessimist, at least not in the short range. Rather, I strive to be a realist, and I aspire to have my emotions be proportionate to the realities that I confront. When good things flow in my direction, I want to be happy. When events speak to misfortune, I want to feel sad. I want to laugh and I want to cry when laughter and tears are called for. Needless to say, different people interpret and respond to reality very differently. There is a huge range of subjectivity with regard to how people interpret, feel about, and respond to their circumstances. There are people who live in poverty and struggle with great adversity and yet maintain a happy outlook. On the other hand, there are people who live lives of luxury and objectively have everything going for them, and yet they are fundamentally miserable. So much of how we respond to the lives we lead is based on what I call temperament. Some people are simply by nature more upbeat, and others more dour and saturnine. And it is their inner temperamental template, so to speak, that molds their emotional responses to the world they engage with. I think we're all born with our temperaments, and I don't think temperament is something that changes very much through life. Again, we have different temperaments. On the other hand, I'm guessing that there is an objective consensus that there are certain things that are good for all human beings and others that are bad for all human beings. With few exceptions, I assume that the majority of humankind would conclude that material comfort is better and ultimately more conducive to happiness than poverty. That it is better to be healthy in body and mind than to be sick and infirm. And that it is better to be surrounded by people who love and care for you and to be supported by friends than it is to be isolated, alone, and lonely. Friedrich Nietzsche had once said, quote, That which does not kill you makes you stronger, end quote. Well, that may sometimes be true, but I think few people would invite any form of adversity in order to test and augment their fortitude. Few people would wish to contract cancer in order to emerge stronger from having endured it, okay? Indeed, I personally am a cancer survivor, and whatever characterological fortitude is accrued from my having engaged cancer, I can truly assure you it was not worth the price of having it in the first place, even though mine was a readily treatable case. Where I'm personally leading is that I am not, personally speaking, I am not compelled to put a sunny gloss on realities that seem to be downright, if not objectively negative, miserable, or awful. There's a great deal of tragedy and suffering in the human condition, both that we endure individually and we experience as a species across the board. And my general approach to such realities, as I see it, is not to deny it, but to accept it as real and when necessary confront and deal with it as best as I can. One consequence of my emotional outlook is to recoil, I'm speaking for myself alone, is to recoil from being cheery when I think there is nothing to be cheery about. I am certainly not a Pollyanna. It is definitely not who I am. And I've got to tell you, one of my weak points is I have trouble with it. You know, everything pushes somebody's button. Pollyanna-ishness pushes my button. I just have a lot of trouble with people who are Pollyannas, right? It's just something that rubs me the wrong way. I'm not saying they're morally bad people. I'm just saying I personally have to grow a little bit in terms of my tolerance. I have a little bit of difficulty with Pollyannas. But this is not at all to say that I am depressed. And I do affirm that there is much in life to celebrate and to be happy about. And whether we find it or not, of course, we all are led to pursue happiness in life, and I personally love to laugh. I love to laugh a great deal. But as I grow older, I must confess that I see that whatever happiness there is in life transpires against a background that is often tragic and involves a great deal of coping. Much of life, in fact, is sheer coping. And of course, much of the hardships that people face go on in private and out of view. I contend that if you scratch the surface and peer underneath, and there is scarcely a family, I find, that is spared great hardship, whether it be a devastating illness, children with monumental problems, chronic disabilities, and the loss that comes with the death of those whom we love. Hence, I have come to the conclusion that the greatness of the human spirit is not to be found in heroics, or even in triumphing over adversity. But it's to be found, I believe, in the sheer doggedness and persistence that people express that enable them to persevere and go on in the face of hardship and tragedies which otherwise appear overwhelming. It is in that doggedness, this resilience, often carried on silently, privately, and unknown to others, that is the circumstance in which human greatness is ultimately found. It is my commitment to this kind of hard-headed realism that refuses to allow me to see a silver lining behind much of human suffering when there is no material or concrete warrant to affirm that there is a silver lining. I don't believe that every problem has a solution, and I don't believe that every crisis or misfortune has a happy ending. In short, bad things happen to good people through no fault of their own. Nature is totally indifferent to our suffering, and reality is not so constituted that things are fated to work out just as we would want them to. To believe that they do, I assert, is a form of magical thinking, and my experience and reason do not permit me to accept such a favorable view of life, of fate, and circumstance. By contrast, Christians may find something redemptive in pain, suffering, and death. This was in fact a mainstay of Mother Teresa's approach to those most marginalized of the poor and the sick and the dying she cared for in Calcutta. She saw their suffering, the suffering of those she cared for, as a gift, and their death, if they accepted Christ, as a thing of beauty. Needless to say, I am not a Christian, and such a value orientation is such that I do not accept, and in truth, to be honest with you, I find it somewhat repugnant. And so, turning to myself for a moment, I do not and cannot put a positive spin on my loss and my grief occasioned by Linda's death. There is nothing good I can say about it. It has been uniquely painful, and my life has been immeasurably diminished because my beloved wife is gone, and gone forever. Being grief-stricken has not changed me for the better. It has not changed me for the better, except in one small particular, which is the inspiration and substance for my talk to you this morning. After Linda died, I opened my small home for 6 evenings, and I was visited by hundreds of people, in fact, many of you who are here in this room today. More than 150 people came to a gathering in my backyard a few weeks later, which was in accordance with my wife's wishes. Scores of people, some of whom I had never met, and were anonymous and remain anonymous, so generously provided support to offset the expenses I incurred after Linda fell ill in London and was hospitalized there for 6 weeks. People continued to come to the home for months afterwards. When Linda became ill, one friend called me every single day for more than a year to offer his support. The outpouring of kindness, concern, and support was simply extraordinary and well beyond what I would have anticipated. And I am left, indeed, friends, with a nagging disturbance that I have not been able to find an adequate way to thank all of those who were so generous, kind, and supportive to me and giving of themselves in my time of greatest need. At the time, needless to say, I was very grateful for their support that I received. But if truth be told, at the time of my wife's death, and for months afterwards, I was so completely in the grip of anguish, grief, and even fear that those emotions impeded my ability to fully absorb the kindness that was being bestowed at the moment, even though, of course, I recognized that kindness was very much present. All I felt was the compulsion to tell over and over again, seemingly endlessly, what befell Linda in her final weeks, including both the catastrophe she suffered and which I witnessed, and the extraordinary compassion of the doctors and nurses at Charing Cross Hospital, who struggled so hard to save her life. For months I feared being alone, and yet I could not be in the presence of more than 1 or 2 people at a time. More than 2 people felt to me overwhelming. 3 years later, my grief is still with me, and I still continue to strategically organize my time so that I don't find myself isolated at home for too long. But that is a long, detailed story, which I won't get into now. What I do want to say is that time changes things, and it has changed me in one particular way, which focuses on the point that I want to make this morning. This is a long introduction. With the passage of time, I have indeed become more sensitive to the kindness of others, and beyond that, more appreciative of the importance of kindness in the human experience. The operative word here is sensitive. I think I am the type of person who has always been appreciative and moved by acts of kindness, whether bestowed on me or in general. What has changed is that my appreciation has become very much heightened and almost visceral, like the person who has a heightened sense of taste, or an exquisite ability to experience the beauty in things, or has a finely attuned ear to music. And so my talk is really a brief meditation on kindness and its importance in the human experience. For me, when constructing a platform address at the Ethical Society, the unpardonable sin is to be platitudinous or be simple. Yet when it comes to kindness, its importance comes from its simplicity. Kindness is very basic, fundamental, and uncomplicated. The problem simply is that we need more of it. It seems to me that we live both public and private lives. Our public lives partake to a noticeable degree of our actions and achievements that by definition are visible to others. Our private lives are conducted among family and friends in relations of intimacy, and as a matter of course away from the view of others. Yet it's not surprising that we tend to measure a person's life more by their public achievements than those which go on in their private lives. The private sphere understandably gets less attention and is perhaps construed, therefore, as in some sense less important. I'm an inveterate obituary reader. I love to read obituaries. Okay? And when one reads the life story of notable people, the emphasis of the biography is almost always on their public achievements, their contributions, or how they were outstanding in their field. Seldom does one read in obituaries that so-and-so loved and was kind to his children, or that she gave generous support to her friends and acquaintances. These things are deemed not so notable. Yet, in the scheme of in the scheme of things, who is to say that this side of a person's life is not of equal importance, even if the consequences of their private relations may influence far fewer people? To use an example very close to home, when we're asked to describe ethical culture, what most often comes to mind, first and foremost, is to place at the top of the list our notable public achievements, having created the visiting nurse service, built settlement houses and schools, and having been involved in the founding of the ACLU and the NAACP, and a host of other achievements of which we are duly proud. But seldom do we define ourselves by our pastoral caring, of the support we give to each other in times of need, and the way in which thousands of people have been supported and enriched by acts of interpersonal caring through the years of what they have given and received from others in quiet ways over periods, again, of decades. These are the acts, I think, that stitch lives together. Yet, if we as ethical culturists contend that we are committed to ethics above all things, who is to say that these smaller, quieter deeds are of less ethical importance than the grand public and political ones? Ethics is measured not only by the number of people who are benefited, but by the nature of the act itself. And there may be more ethics in the kindness we bestow with a generous heart onto others in need than in the performance of great public deeds that finds us in the spotlight and brings public acclaim. When Felix Adler created ethical culture, he affirmed that its ultimate purpose was not vested in public acts of social justice, though this is essential to ethical culture, but rather in the cultivation of what he called ethical personality in each of its members. And certainly being kind to others and to ourselves is a component of ethical personality. I've often noticed that we can think of values in two ways, or there are two kinds of values. There are what I would call the hard ethical values, identified among others with such things as justice, equality, fairness, and courage. Then there are the softer values, such as love, compassion, and kindness among them. I suspect that the softer values are sometimes disparaged in that they are equated with weakness, and there may be more than a hint of sexism in that. They are often identified with feminine traits that are differentiated from the values of strength, aggression, and manliness that are much prized in our dog-eat-dog world, in which success is measured so often in terms of power and wealth, and not by one's fundamental humanity. If we speak in a political context, I think now is a time which especially calls out for the cultivation of these softer values. We all know that we live in an era which has become extraordinarily raw, nasty, and mean, in which there is a hardening of public discourse and a coarsening of attitudes, especially targeting those who are different, minorities, and so forth. But beyond that, and aggravating it, we also live in a time of greater social breakdown, in which institutional life and affiliations have grown weaker, whether it be unions, fraternal organizations, clubs, and I will give churches their due too here as well. I think more and more people feel isolated and alone and are indeed lonely. Most graphically, we witness an increase in what has come to be called deaths of despair. That is, people dying in staggering numbers by suicide and opioid addictions, which I surmise has something to do with the weakening of communal and institutional life. It is these coarser social realities related to individual isolation which makes communities, such as our ethical society, I believe, so very important. Indeed, I would argue that it is that in our communal function, we are more important than we may ostensibly realize and appreciate and give ourselves credit for. The softer values and acts of more private outreach that convey them are more communal values that bring people closer together and enrich the fabric of the social bond. And as suggested, such values of kindness can be cultivated by certain behavioral choices we make and by putting them into practice. Let me make some basic observations as to how kindness can be cultivated. One way to be kind to others is to simply pay attention, and engage in simple acts of affirmation of the other person. One study I came upon was conducted by a psychologist named John Gottman, who investigated why some marriages thrive while others don't. The former he referred to as masters, and the latter he referred to as disasters. An article in the Atlantic magazine summarized the point of his study, and I present an excerpt from that. Okay. Gottman wanted to know how the masters, that is, those involved in successful marriages, wanted to know how the masters created a culture of love and intimacy, and how the disasters squashed it. In a follow-up study in 1990, he designed a lab on the University of Washington campus to look like a beautiful bed and breakfast retreat. He invited 130 newlywed couples to spend the day at this retreat and watch them as they did what couples normally do on vacation: cook, clean, listen to music, eat, chat, and hang out. And one thing he doesn't mention, given that they were newlyweds and they were involved in sex, I don't know what that is. Right. And Gottman made a critical discovery in his study, one that gets at the heart of why some relationships thrive while others languish. Throughout the day, partners would make requests for connection, what Gottman calls, quote, bids. Bids, requests for connections, bids. For example, say that the husband is a bird enthusiast and notices a goldfinch fly across the yard. He might say to his wife, quote, look at that beautiful bird outside. He's not just commenting on the bird here, he's requesting a response from his wife, a sign of interest and support, hoping they'll connect, however momentarily, over the bird. The wife now has a choice. She can respond by either, quote, turning away or turning towards her husband, as Gottman put it. Though the bird bid might seem minor and silly, it can actually reveal a lot about the health of the relationship. The husband thought the bird was important enough to bring it up in conversation, and the question is whether his wife recognizes and respects that. People who turned towards their partners in the study responded by engaging the bidder, showing interest and support in the bid. Those who didn't, those who turned away, would not respond or respond minimally and continue doing whatever they were doing, like watching TV or reading the paper. Sometimes they would respond with overt hostility, saying something like, stop interrupting me now, I'm reading. Okay? They might say, stop interrupting, I'm looking at my cell phone, or something like that. These bidding interactions had profound effects, he concluded, on marital well-being. Couples who had divorced after a 6-year follow-up had turned toward bids 33% of the time. Only 3 in 10 of their bids for emotional connection were met with intimacy. The couples who were still together after 6 years had turned toward bids 87% of the time. 9 times out of 10, they were meeting their partner's emotional needs. Okay, that's the end of that quote. These acts of turning toward the other rather than turning away, of paying attention and affirming the other person, are very simple interactions, which I contend are basic expressions of kindness. Not paying attention, ignoring the other, is to be unkind. And what pertains to marriage, I contend, pertains to human relations more generally. Whether we are talking about other family members, friends, acquaintances, co-workers, members of our own ethical culture society, and even strangers. Through effort and practice, I think we can cultivate the ability to attend and to focus on the other, and so enhance our ability to be kind. So being attentive and focused, I contend, is a way of cultivating kindness. So is being present. So is being present. In my role as leader of the Ethical Society, a member, knowing that someone is in the hospital or has a need which is limiting them, will sometimes ask me whether it is appropriate for them to pay that person a visit. They're sitting on the fence. They don't know what to do. Should I visit or not visit? And I have found that unless we have compelling evidence that such a visit would be unwanted or unwarranted, my response is that it is almost always better to err on the side of being present. Going out of one's way, changing one's routine to simply be present and sharing time with the other person who may be in the hospital or homebound is a simple expression of kindness that can go a very long way. It is often met with greater appreciation than we realize. Sometimes people don't want to do this because they feel they don't know what to say to the other person. Maybe they're sick, or maybe they're even actively dying and they don't know what to say. But you know, the people whom we visit are very merciful and forgiving. If a person is dying and you come to visit them, they don't want you to make them live. All they want to know is that you care, that you are there. They don't ask much from us. And I've learned that just the fact of presence can go a very long way. It's a very simple act of kindness that we can all engage in, and I think we need to earn in that direction. A third practice is finding ways to commend the efforts of others rather than to criticize. This is one way in which I think this community has in fact gotten much better and has become much kinder over the 4 decades that I've been involved in it. Rita, do you agree with me? Okay, right, you do. We have gotten better. For some people, the penchant to criticize comes too easily and is expressed too glibly. Certainly there are times to criticize the performance and acts of others, but how one does it becomes of paramount importance. We can render criticism in a gratuitous and superior way, or we can be critical when it is necessary in ways that respect the intentions, the humanity, and often the very hard work of the other. And we can start off by acknowledging what was positive in what he or she did before we have to render what we think might have fallen short. But the point I really want to make here is that we need to cultivate the art of commendation. When someone does a job well, or even when she hasn't, but has made her best effort, I think to acknowledge that act is an act of kindness that is important to convey. But it needs to be conveyed with honesty and without the intent or impression that one is offering praise because they expect something from the other in return. Commendation rendered at its best needs to be sincere and heartfelt and not syrupy or false. And finally, I do want to make, and this for me is a big concession, I do want to make a concession to pop culture. I do believe in in the movement that has come to be known as the performance of random acts of kindness. Okay, I think there's a great deal of beauty in that. I mean, sometimes the pop culture does things in the pop culture really have more substance than I, in my own critical view, would want to give it credit for. Okay, and random acts of kindness, I think, are particularly extraordinary and important when they come unexpected. Life is hard, and much in our harried, busy lives is overscheduled, stress-inducing, and often tedious. Small acts of kindness are like gifts and acts of grace. I am always moved with a special kind of joy when a friend calls by surprise and asks if I am free to go out to lunch today. Not 3 weeks from next Tuesday with 45 minutes wedged between all-important business meetings. Okay. Such acts of kindness, I find, are all too rare, and when I am on the receiving end, they've come with a certain sense of liberation. I feel liberated when I'm on the receiving end of those invitations. There's an endless number of such small gifts, from doing the laundry for someone who may be temporarily indisposed to bringing someone who's homebound a meal, or just again paying a visit. We may drive someone to the doctor who needs a ride, or call to check up on a friend who has been ill, or attend an exhibit when her artwork is on display. Help a mother carry her baby carriage up the subway stairs, and you may have read a woman died, in fact, falling down the subway stairs a few days ago. Had someone been kind enough to help her, she might still be alive today. Or an act of kindness may simply be extending a smile or a kind word to a stranger at an appropriate moment. The cultivation of kind deeds, so understood, does not entail locking yourself into a lifelong commitment. Often, just a one-time gesture is all that's needed. It is the nature of the human experience, I think, that a little bit can go a very long way. If we all cultivated this style, I conclude that we would lighten the burdens of the human condition, make our fellow human beings that much happier, and we would strengthen the human bond. We all occupy a small planet, and the ultimate destiny of humanity is unknown. And for those of us who do not affirm a divine custodian or heavenly companion, all we have is one another. And so doing right by one another should be our highest aim. It was in a similar vein that Albert Einstein had once beautifully said, quote, "How strange is the lot of us mortals. Each of us is here for a brief sojourn, for what purpose he knows not, though he sometimes thinks he senses it. But without deeper reflection, one knows from daily life that one exists for other people. First of all, for those upon whose smiles and well-being our own happiness is wholly dependent, and then for the many unknown to us, to whose destinies we are tied by bonds of sympathy. This, I think, end quote, this, I think, is a kind of humanist creed. We are here for one another, and we are tied to others by fellow feeling. And I would add that acts of love and kindness in the private sectors of our lives are what bind us together, and which are what we should strive to live for. Well, I'd like to end where I began. Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey is a nature poem. It's an expression of what we might call nature mysticism. Returning to that rustic and secluded place surrounded by trees, hills, streams, and hedges after an absence of 5 years, the poet intuits that coursing through nature, there is a type of pure spirit which he senses links nature to what is morally best in human beings. In the presence of undisturbed nature, the poet finds not only peace, but something that is lasting, something that endures. But beyond that, Wordsworth feels that in the sublimity of nature, there is also a linkage, as noted, to something in us. And so he notes, quote, "For I've learned to look on nature not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity," end quote. The, quote, "still sad music of humanity," and then he says that the best portion of a good man's life, his little nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. That line has always stayed with me and has moved me since I first read that poem many years ago. For it speaks to something so very true in the human experience, something that deserves to be recognized but so seldom is. The small, commonplace acts of kindness that make for human goodness and speak to what is best in us. And so my message is, let us not take them for granted, but with modesty, let us practice kindness and thereby strive to lighten the burdens of our fellow human beings and bring to others greater joy and a sense of well-being, and the knowledge that in this world, which is so often harsh and indifferent to our tender needs, there is still goodness to be found.